Our speaker this week is Dr. Elena Mustakova, and her topic is Shift to Global Consciousness from a Bahá'í Perspective. Dr. Elena Mustakova is an educator, social scientist, former professor in adult developmental psychology, and a counselor and psychotherapist in private practice in the Metro DC area. She has received academic recognition for her scholarship, writing, and international lecturing on the development of moral consciousness and the rethinking of psychology to address the spiritual needs of a global age. Her dedication is to the spiritual empowerment of individuals and communities. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Mustakova.
Thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction. And thank you for hosting this wonderful gathering, which I understand has become very popular. People are watching it all over the world, which is wonderful to know. I'm going to share my screen now and would like to start by reminding those of you who may have watched my previous talk from December 2020 that talk ended with a shift towards global unity consciousness, and there was questions from the audience. Are we really seeing this shift, and what are the evidences of this shift? And so there was a general consensus that we need to come back and explore this shift a little bit more, which is what I'll try to do today. This talk, as well as the previous one, are part of an upcoming book titled Global Unity of Healing, which will be on Amazon, hopefully in September of this year. And now I'd like to start where we left off in December. The topic in December, many of you will remember, was, is spirituality helpful for mental health? And at that point, we started by taking a moment to recognize that our experience of disintegration within our lives and in society, and really internationally as well, is quite overwhelming and much more obvious, both in the news and all around us. And that this experience is so intense that it's often difficult for us to understand what is really ailing us. And what I suggested in December is that what is most ailing us is that we really do not understand what we're living. The ground is shifting from underneath us. No familiar concepts and ways seem to hold. We are experiencing a cascading of health, social, and ecological degradation. Familiar institutions, family structures, everything is rapidly losing its lasting meaning. And we are just going day in, day out, very much by habit. And I don't mean to paint a bleak picture, but I'd like to really acknowledge what is so overwhelming for most of us that is hard to even acknowledge. This is the reality we're living, and it's quite confusing. It is accompanied also, and we discussed that in December, by a flattening of language. As our view of ourselves and life has become quite uninspiring, our language reflects that. And of course, I can just give just a few examples, but you can look all around you and pay attention to the language that surrounds you. People used to talk about aspirations. Now, most frequently, we hear the words ambition or drive. And you can see a real collapsing of horizons from aspiration to ambition or drive. People used to talk about longing for truth. Now what we most often hear is, I'm trying to figure this out. It's almost a computational process. The human spirit has always been searching. Now, more commonly, we hear about experimenting. The quest for truth has more commonly devolved into individual opinions. and on examples of a flattened perspective and a flattened language surround us. And they're so common and pervasive that we don't really even notice them. So, what is really happening? Many of us know that it is darkest before the dawn. And oftentimes, when the dawn begins to break on the horizon, most of us are asleep and not aware of it until many, many hours later. That seems to be the case also with the appearance of new cycles in human history. The appearance of these new cycles is always much more visible from decades and centuries later. When we look back, we can see the cycle of the appearance of every one of the great wisdom traditions and the way they have impacted society building, culture, consciousness, and every aspect of human life. It's much more possible to see it from centuries later, but at the time when a new cycle of human consciousness breaks through or begins or is really initiated, we are generally oblivious to that for, shall we say, many decades or even centuries later. And so we're living in this very blurry perspective. And so talks like this allow us to put things into a somewhat different perspective and consider a different angle. Perhaps we don't know what we're living because, and the ground is shifting because a new level of understanding has been released and we're trying to grow into it, and it's quite difficult. And I will suggest that this stream of unitive evolutionary wisdom that was released in the middle of the 19th century was the Baha'i integral spiritual perspective. This is a perspective that is still widely unknown in depth, and probably will take centuries for it to be properly studied, properly understood, and for people to grasp the fullness of its relevance to our lives now and to the life of society right now. But that's often the case when a new cycle begins. And because we're living in such flattened times in which we can only acknowledge that which we can touch and measure, material reality, it is important to take a step back and think a little bit more deeply about ontology. What is the nature of reality? Which is sort of an underlying theme today. From an ontological perspective, every so often in human history, a new cycle of consciousness emerges, a new level of consciousness emerges, and it's associated with a prophet, a manifestation. And such a manifestation gives laws for this new level of evolution of human consciousness. And Baha'u'llah gave this new level of understanding. He released this new level of understanding and new laws in the middle of the 19th century. And this understanding really fused together in a unique way the great religions of the East and the West into a novel evolutionary perspective on human consciousness and community building. This perspective follows the evolution of human consciousness collectively into establishing a peaceful global civilization. There is a gap between this revelation and the appearance of what I would call what Abdul Baha, a central figure in the Baha'i dispensation, described as second level prophets. Those are prophets who are in fact followers and promulgators of great new ideas that become released in human consciousness. And today we'll hear of many such figures who are promulgators of this understanding, oftentimes without really even knowing that that's what they're in fact promulgating. In the 20th century, many forward thinkers sensed that the condition of humanity was becoming so confused and confusing that it is clearly time for a new cycle of human consciousness. And one of them was psychiatrist Erich Fromm, who wrote in the middle of the 20th century in The Sane Society. As you can see, for those who see in the monotheistic religions only one of the stations of the evolution of the human race, it is not too far-fetched to believe that a new religion will develop, which will correspond to the development of the human race. The most important features of such religion will be its universalistic character, corresponding to the unification of mankind taking place in this epoch. It would embrace the humanistic teachings common to all religions of East and West. Its doctrines will not contradict the rational insight of mankind today. And its emphasis would be on the practice of life rather than on doctrinal beliefs. Religion, of course, cannot be invented. It will come into existence with the appearance of a new great teacher, just as they have appeared in previous centuries when time was ripe. In the meantime, those who believe in God should express their faith by waiting, and those who do not believe by living the precepts of love and justice. So it's very interesting that Erich Fromm, as a psychiatrist who studied the human condition in the middle of the 20th century and how to help people, sensed that our condition was becoming so disoriented that it was clearly a time for a new level of understanding to be released in human consciousness. Of course, at that time, that release had already occurred. The Baha'i evolutionary spiritual paradigm offers a comprehensive, evolutionary and holistic approach to history and consciousness. This approach is unique, even though in the middle of the 19th century, there was a number of great thinkers who were trying to articulate aspects of this approach. There's, of course, the work of Charles Darwin on evolution, and he focused not just on biological evolution of species, but he also recognized the reality of social evolution and even tried to speak about evolutionary sociobiology, but that became quite lost in the way his writings were translated. At the same time, we also know of the work of Georg Hegel, who explained in the mid-19th century again, well, before that actually, the dialectic of development, the dialectic of the evolution of new stages of consciousness from the tension of opposites. And he also made the distinction between civil society and the state, which is a very contemporary idea. There was also the work of Herbert Spencer, who translated Darwinian theory into the concept of social Darwinism, the all too familiar concept of the survival of the fittest, but also he spoke of social evolution, with which he is less well known. He recognized the fact that we are in fact undergoing a social evolution towards a more just and sustainable society. So as you can see, each of these thinkers sensed something about the nature of the time in which in fact a shift in consciousness was occurring. But this shift in consciousness was only fully and integrally articulated at that time by the Baha'i dispensation. And that, anticipated by a full century, contemporary developments such as the field of integral studies and evolutionary worldview, and it combined the mystical with the social and the global a good century before people began to think in those terms. This dispensation offered a very concrete and also transformative methodology for collective reorganizing of society. This was a remarkable event, and as all such remarkable events, it went unnoticed, but its impact began to reverberate, and the shift towards unitive consciousness, which we are experiencing more and more, is in fact in many ways an expression of this release of energy. So how does this relate to each one of us? How does that relate to me? In this age, with this new level of consciousness released, humanity is called to read its own reality, or as we see here in this excerpt from Baha'u'llah's The Call of the Divine Beloved, one must read the book of one's own self. Although at the beginning this is the realm of conflict, yet it endeth in attainment to the throne of splendor. What is that throne of splendor? In this age, we are able to question everything. We're invited to rethink everything, but it has an evolutionary purpose. The evolutionary purpose that is explained to us really through the Baha'i writings quite directly in a contemporary language is that we come into this physical plane with the potential capacity for free will, and that this capacity evolves progressively as we use it more consciously, and that it is our task to learn in this life how to use our free will towards a fully awakened and purposeful life. And that is the process of the development of free will in the lifespan, from the plane of conflict to the plane of self-transcendence, and what Baha'u'llah calls in the Four Valleys, the unity of self, reason, and love. This is a process that began in the 19th century in all kinds of mystical, as well as personal, psychological, and collective social ways. This process is in full swing now, as people are exploring, this is a common term these days, how we can use our free will in correct ways. But in the Baha'i dispensation, there was spelled out also a profound understanding of the dialectic between individual and collective, that we are not just out there exploring our own use of free will and the development of our correct use of free will, that in fact that happens in relationship to society and to human governance. And there is the recognition that human governance has become so disconnected from the reality of soul and spirit that that causes a deepening instability in our global condition. And the instability is also causing a painful and radical systemic awakening and rethinking of what my life is, what our collective life is about, how stewardship of this planet has to shift for us to have a planet to leave to our children, and what our choices imply every step of the way. So the dynamic interaction between individual and collective is the enormous call to awakening of this age. And we are seeing it much more fully now than it was evident when this vision was first released in the middle of the 19th century. More and more people are recognizing the truth of these words uttered in 1933. We cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us and say that once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. So we cannot be healthy while we continue to separate ourselves from the world around us and try to just heal ourselves. That is not possible. And that is the topic of my book, Global Unitive Healing, that our individual healing and our collective healing are interdependent. The human heart cannot be separated from its environment, and we only heal and develop the correct use of our free will to the extent to which we're also engaged in trying to heal our environments. This dialectical understanding of collective unitive healing, which was revealed in the middle of the 19th century, is now becoming more accessible for more people and is being realized on many different levels, even as it is often not associated with the source of this revelation in the middle of the 19th century. When the evolution of human consciousness was thus redefined, faith was also redefined. In the words of Abdul Baha, faith in this modern age is a universal divine foundation which should become stripped of every dogmatic distinction and become a cause of love in human hearts. Abdul Baha, of course, became the first global peace ambassador. Now there is a whole movement of cultivating global peace ambassadors. There was a book by this title that came out at the end of the 20th century, Becoming a Peace Ambassador. But in 1912, 1911, 1912, 1913, Abdul Baha was a visionary teacher of reconciliation among all religions and races and between religion and science as he traveled to the West and taught and spoke and met with people of every walk of life and really embodied universal consciousness long before these terms were common at all or really even understood. Baha'u'llah also taught a whole new understanding of the relationship between wisdom traditions, which is known by the term progressive revelation. The concept of progressive revelation, that every wisdom tradition is part of the evolutionary revealing and guidance of divine wisdom that ushers humanity to its next stage of collective maturation and evolution. And so these different religions are really different expressions of the same source. This understanding of progressive revelation removes existing barriers between different religious and wisdom traditions and views them all as a part of a continuum of unfolding spiritual understanding that guides the evolution of human civilization. Such understanding, once again, articulated in the 19th century when it was completely revolutionary, is now pretty commonly accepted by people who ask these questions. We have a very strong contemporary interfaith and interspirituality movements. And I separate them because they are very interconnected, but they're also two separate movements. And they emphasize the common core of all wisdom traditions, the common spiritual core, the universal spiritual principles that guide the evolution of individual and collective consciousness. In the 21st century, this is fairly rapidly spreading and more common understanding. And again, the roots of it in the mid-19th century are often not recognized. Again, this progressive revelation also emphasized the complementarity of scientific and contemplative inquiry. Another fairly well accepted concept now, which was probably most clearly and lucidly articulated in the integral philosophy of Ken Wilber towards the end of the 20th century. But its roots, once again, precede by a whole century the recognition of these ideas. So this new cycle of human consciousness explained reality as unitive, and therefore being able to be studied both scientifically and contemplatively. It explained religion as unitive in all of its different historical manifestations. It explained human consciousness as unitive and evolving. And it also developed an epistemology. An epistemology means a way of knowing. It cultivated through the use of language, a way of knowing that unites heart and mind, analytical, reasoned understanding with mystical perception, with heartfelt intuitions. And in doing so, this Baha'i spiritual language released into collective consciousness an opportunity to heal the modern dissociation of value spheres and the split between the language of science, the language of arts, the language of morals, which is something we've all grown up with. Baha'i spiritual language transforms that into a new evolutionary synthesis, which is only just now beginning to be studied and realized. So how did unitive healing advance into the 20th century? A complete list is impossible here, but we see that just a year after the passing of Baha'u'llah, the first Parliament of World Religions took place. At the same time, we saw the emergence of theosophy, which was a very intellectual effort of inquiry to try to find the common ground and the synthesis between Eastern and Western spiritualism. At the same time, in psychology, pivotal understanding grew and pivotal texts were released that began to illuminate the connection between our objective knowing and our subjective knowing. And this, of course, was the work of William James, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and a number of others. At the same time, as I already mentioned, while these ideas were being promulgated, remember this is the second level of prophecy, the level of promulgating what a new cycle of human consciousness articulates. So this promulgation, which was really spreading through the 20th century, was happening at the same time in which Abdu'l-Baha was promulgating these ideas not so much through words, but through his actual way of being in the West. He modeled for the West planetary consciousness at a time of deep racist splits in the West. He modeled and called for a universal human being, for universal understanding and for unification in practice, in action among the races, religions, and also religion and science. At the same time, a well-known and well-loved Eastern spiritual teacher, Yogananda, developed a rigorous practice, meditation-based approach to the disciplined effort to evolve our consciousness beyond our own conflicted nature and attractions to partial realities. Through meditation, he developed a rigorous method of, in fact, developing individual consciousness towards more universal awareness and understanding. So you could see throughout the 20th century, and these are just very few of the many examples that can be listed, how the shift towards unity of consciousness was gaining momentum, and it was really seeping into every corner of society, along with the growing realization of our oneness and interdependence. We have to mention here the remarkable work of Teilhard de Chardin, Catholic priest and scientist, paleontologist, whose radical quest into the concept of evolution caused him to be banned from theological activity, to be silenced by the Catholic Church in 1925, and to suffer profoundly while he was trying to articulate what became his classic understanding, the developmental view of history as a great or grand ascent towards higher capabilities of humanity, our collective spiritual evolution. you see the very same idea that we are evolving towards a whole new level of consciousness together. And all of our lostness and all of our confusion is part of this evolutionary process, which points towards what he called the omega point, the point of unity, unity consciousness. When he presented this book to Rome, his classic work, The Phenomenon of Man, that articulates these ideas in 1941, the book was, within a decade after that, forbidden. But of course, the ideas continued to spread. In 1937, we see the founding of the first World Federalist Organization, and within a decade, 6 such organizations form the United World Federalist Organization. At the same time, in the East, the Indian philosopher and politician Sri Aurobindo taught in Asia, and you can see the years of his most prominent teaching here, again, about the evolutionary ascent of humanity towards universal consciousness in our journey towards self-realization. So you see how these ideas are now being promulgated East and West by people from every religious orientation, scientists as well as spiritual figures, and are becoming what Kurt Johnson and Ord in their 2012 excellent book towards world, which is The Coming Interspiritual Age. They call this whole process the 4th great advancement of human civilization. The 4th great advancement, the advancement towards a worldwide civilization. And they do recognize that that advancement in fact began in 1850, even as they don't really explore the roots of it in the 1850. It's simply mentioned that that is the beginning of that timeline, and that this advancement towards worldwide civilization really is surging in the 20th century. At the same time, in science, there is a growing recognition of the primacy of consciousness over matter. In other words, the primacy of spiritual reality. The father of quantum theory, Max Planck, in his 1944 address, The Essence of Matter, said, "All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind." Now compare this to an excerpt from Baha'u'llah's Book of the Covenant, Kitab-i-Ahd, that was written approximately 1891. Baha'u'llah says, "A mighty force, a consummate power, lieth concealed in the world of being. Fix your gaze upon it, and upon its unifying influence, and not upon the differences which appear from it." So, at the same time, we also see the emergence of a whole institute for the study of consciousness. And it was co-founded by Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell. After he traveled back in his spaceship from the moon, and in the vast darkness of the cosmos saw our beautiful blue planet and experienced an epiphany, realizing the interconnectedness of all life and consciousness on this planet. And I highly recommend that you seek out and view the documentaries Overview and Planetary. They're 2 stunning documentaries that really convey this vision and capture this historical moment of our emerging awakening. Not only are we lost and confused, we're also awakening. And these 2 documentaries really capture it quite well. We also saw at the end of the second part of the 20th century, the last few decades, the emergence of what has now become known as the integral philosophy. It really was launched with Ken Wilber's seminal work, The Spectrum of Consciousness, and was then summarized 2 decades later in his The Marriage of Sense and Soul, which I highly recommend. In this integral philosophy, Ken Wilber describes really, and that's a full century after the Baha'i dispensation, what's really happened to us in modernity. He speaks about the rise of modernity and the dignity of modernity as this wonderful differentiation of the spheres of arts, morals, and science. He calls that the dignity of modernity. Because in the ancient pre-modern religious worldviews, the great chain of being saw everything as a continuum from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit, as enfolding levels of reality. But modernity began to differentiate and study separately these levels. And so different fields of inquiry developed, which is the big accomplishment of the modern age. With that, however, we became so carried away that we found ourselves in what he calls the modern predicament, the dissociation of the value spheres, or the disaster of modernity, or the modern flatland, as he calls it, where we conceive now of the universe as mostly that which can be seen, measured, observed, and the language of science so dominates over the language of art and morals, and they are such separate languages that we experience a fracturedness of consciousness. So the integral philosophy that he articulated, integral evolutionary philosophy, in fact breaks down and explains what the Baha'i dispensation released into human consciousness, which is the need in this global age for us to integrate the internal realm, the interior individual, and the interior collective with the exterior realm, the realm of behavior on every level, from molecules and cells and organs and individual humans to planets and the collective exterior social realm. So Ken Wilber explained that as the four quadrants, the intentional and the cultural, these are the internal, the interior quadrants, and the behavioral and the social, these are the exterior. And he explained how our understanding of each of these four quadrants actually evolves, and it evolves towards a synthesis of all four. It evolves towards a coherence and a heart-mind epistemology. When we go to the Baha'i writings from a century earlier, we discover a language that actually does that. And we discover principles that actually articulate that in a different, more poetic, more inspirational language. Whereas here, this is explained very clearly, very rationally, very scientifically. So the global mind change is clearly underway, but this also became a title that was a book published by a futurist and a Stanford professor who was generally considered way too radical for his analysis of the spiritual and moral crisis of the Western industrial culture. What he was teaching at Stanford at the time in the 70s and 80s, that became spelled out in his book, Global Mind Change, is that we're living through a pending shift towards recognizing the primacy of consciousness, and that implies a change in how we live, every aspect of our individual and collective lives, personal, familial, economic, corporate, financial, political, educational, healthcare, social institutions, everything. And he identified these four challenges to the present declining order, which are now very familiar to us. That all still sounded a bit radical when he was writing and teaching in the 70s and the 80s. But the issue of environmental sustainability, of equity and justice, of marginalization of people and cultures, and the need for a worldview change are now familiar concepts, not just familiar, but really quite central in the public sphere just a few decades later. And so what the book Global Unity of Healing attempts to do, it really follows in the steps of global mind change, and it attempts to describe through individual lives, through clinical vignettes, as well as through larger perspectives, national and global perspectives, how in fact this healing is taking place. This was a prediction in the 1970s and 80s it was a horizon released and named in the middle of the 19th century. We're in the middle of it now. We're living it. And that's the purpose of Global Unity of Healing, to bring it home to every one of us, how exactly we're living it and what we can do about it. The turn of the century also saw the birth of the interfaith and the strengthening of the interfaith and the interspirituality movement. And I'm going to have to go a little more rapidly through the last few slides here to give us time for questions. But the interfaith movement, which really began in the turn of the 20th century, is now quite strong, as we know. But many have not heard the term interspirituality. It is associated with the work of a Catholic lay monk by the name of Wayne Teasdale, also known as Brother Wayne, who wrote the book The Mystic Heart. And in it, he expressed his conviction that we are at the dawn of an interspiritual age, and that regardless of what wisdom tradition we come from, or whether it's a wisdom tradition or it's a humanistic tradition, this interspiritual age is characterized by some very common aspects. People embrace a spiritual practice, try to live out the virtues, not simply talk or preach about them. And that is done through a life of compassionate action in all aspects of life and selfless service. That such a life challenges us towards personal integration and the cultivation of mature self-knowledge. It is also a life of simplicity, which is the opposite of consumerism. And it's a life in which each of us finds our own prophetic moral voice. So there is a sense of moral imperative in every such life. I don't know if you even hear the term moral imperative a whole lot these days, but think about, what does that mean and where do I recognize it around me? So interspiritual understanding essentially points to the fact that all religious traditions recognize a shared collective field of consciousness that encompasses the earthbound and spiritual realms. And in that context, and that's again the Johnson and Ord book, Baha'u'llah is recognized as an early interspiritual pioneer, which of course is very far from his actual station as really the figure, the manifestation that released this interpersonal, interspiritual understanding into collective consciousness. But such is the nature of short-term historical perspective. As I said in the beginning, it takes centuries before we can fully see things in their full context and significance. Another evidence of global mind change. There's lots of evidences. This is a book that recently came out, Our Moment of Choice. I'm just showing it here for a moment. This is a collection of the work of 43 evolutionary leaders who share their creative solutions to addressing the challenges of contemporary humanity. It's a book I highly recommend. It's very inspirational because you see 43 evolutionary leaders from different convictions with different spiritual practices, but they are all initiating collective processes to really to spearhead this shift in consciousness that we are living, some of us more consciously, some of us less consciously, but we're all living it. I do mention here also the work of Barbara Max Hubbard, a futurist who wrote and spoke about conscious evolution and really became associated with the concept of conscious evolution. Another important source is Lynn McTaggart's The Field, where she summarizes the discoveries of quantum physicists from all over the world and how they converge into describing this collective field, interdependent field that envelops all life. There's also the work of the SHIP Network, which is a massive global movement to use education, media, and resources to propel this consciousness shift forward. But you can see a much more detailed timeline of our conscious evolution in Robert Atkinson's recently published book, 2017, I believe, The Story of Our Time. It's an outstanding summary of the contemporary evolution of consciousness, and it offers a detailed timeline. I don't have time to stop here, but in the psychological fields and in human services, more and more there is a growing understanding, which I approach from the point of view of health realization, which was a branch of psychological and psychotherapeutic work that focused on human resiliency. It happens to be the perspective that I practice, which really began to help people understand their innate mental health, despite all of our personal, social, and historical conditioning, as a moment-to-moment process of alignment with universal reality. So this is a radically new perspective, even in psychology at the end of the 20th century, that no longer are we just defined by our personal configurations, but moment by moment, we have access to a much more elevated consciousness at every moment that we're fully in the now, aligned with universal mind, with universal reality. Our creative power of thought and consciousness can give us a completely different experience of life and a different horizon. And that's something we have access to, and it's an access we have to cultivate. So you can see that in every field, there's this shift. This is another example. Examples really abound, but this was an example that came from Nina Meerhoff, actually, who's the founder of Children of the Earth, came from an interspiritual perspective and also an educator. And her realization was that youth, as the next generation of consciousness, need arenas to explore and begin to visualize how they can work for the collective good. And so she created this, this program that went global in the 90s of an interdisciplinary spiritual framework to explore, for young people to explore their inner life. It's a very interspiritual framework. It's not rooted in one religious tradition. And as they explore their inner life, to also learn how to become socially responsible and work for uniting the planet. So the concept of reflect, connect, and act. And more recently, they're opening a center adjacent to Auschwitz, which is going to be called City of Hope, One Humanity Institute, that will illustrate and become a hub for the global movement from I to we to one. And one last example that comes directly from the biological sciences and the work of David Sloan Wilson on sociobiological evolution. This organization, Pro-Social Work, works to optimize bonds of cooperation within and among small groups, with the understanding that small groups constitute cooperative and equitable ecosystems. And if we learn how to optimize small groups, they can grow and interconnect towards a cooperative global organism. To Baha'is, this is, again, a very familiar concept, but it was developed recently by a scientist as an approach to social transformation around core design principles for building better functioning groups. And I will have to move here to my closing slide. All of this is in a way summed up in the Baha'i spiritual framework for social change, which describes a path to healing, unity, and social justice through building diverse communities all over the world where individual and collective empowerment go hand in hand, where social action springs from the application of spiritual principles to social and economic life, where people of every walk of life engage in discourse to transform society and develop unity. So the Baha'i dispensation from the 19th century has now given rise, while it is being spread and promulgated by many teachers unsuspecting their roots in this 19th century event all over the world. The small but very active Baha'i community has been very consciously developing the implications of this dispensation into this spiritual framework for social change. And in 1985, the Universal Governing Council of the Baha'i Global Community, the Universal House of Justice, released the Promise of World Peace, in which it describes our global Baha'i community as a single social organism, representative of the diversity of the human family, and conducting its affairs through consultative principles, based on spiritual guidance, and open for the rest of the world to learn and explore as we're all moving towards unity, healing, and unity consciousness. So with that, I'd like to thank you and be open to questions.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Mustakova. It was really enlightening and really comprehensive, and it helped me understand the topic. So if we have any questions, you can put it in the chat and I will read it out. So Richard asks, how can we get a copy of your forthcoming book?
Well, hopefully it's going to be on Amazon in September. It's due to come out the end of August or the first week of September.
He asks, what's the title of the book?
Global Unitive Healing, Integral Skills for Individual and Collective Transformation.
Thank you. We have a question from Scott, and he asks, are there any others in the beyond, are there others beyond Johnson and Ord in the mainstream who are starting to get a glimpse of Baha'u'llah's station?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say that there is a real glimpse of Baha'u'llah's station yet. I couldn't answer this definitively. My sense is that Baha'u'llah's station is not understood yet. It's really not fully discussed, even not fully understood in the Johnson and Ord book either. But the ideas are permeating, really permeating contemporary thought, both East and West, very, very rapidly. And there is some increasing recognition of the fact that such an event did occur, that something did in fact happen around 1850, that this is a very integral by nature and evolutionary paradigm when people weren't even using those terms at that time. So there's a growing recognition. That's what I can say.
Thank you. We have a question from David. He asks, can you explain more about innate mental health, what it is, and how it can be accessed/developed?
That's a wonderful question. I think we really very much need it at this time, because it is a time of such turbulence and so much pain that it's really important for every one of us to realize that we are not defined by our history, we're not defined by our circumstances, we're not defined by our pains and our losses, that human reality is in fact primarily the reality of consciousness, which is what quantum physics is telling us. And so to the extent that consciousness is fully awakened and aligned to its source, in every such moment, consciousness is elevated, comprehensive, empowered. experiences joy, experiences vision, experiences wisdom, hope, resilience. And that's a moment by moment reality, of course. We step in and out of that kind of alignment to universal reality all the time. And that is the learning of this life. So we are in innate mental health in any moment when we are aligned with universal consciousness, whether it's through prayer and meditation or just through a deep connection to spiritual reality and acting and living from that place with that intention, with that awareness. As soon as we start to focus on our personal reality and to dwell on our limitations and losses and angst and fears, we start to feel small, we start to feel more limited, more frightened, and certainly don't feel healthy. And so the path to moment by moment mental health, I think Abdu'l Baha described very well. If you're feeling really, really bad, find somebody who's in a worse condition than you and try to help them. And that will make you feel so much better. That will really elevate your consciousness. And so that is our innate mental health, that we are always capable to elevate our vision and to align our vision. And when we do, we feel happy, even as we suffer the blows that come with living in this very, very turbulent time.
Thank you. We have a question from Richard. In this movement towards global consciousness and global civilization, there seems also to be a consistent tension with people and organizations that react with the fear of losing sovereignty in one form or another. Any thoughts on how to approach this tension?
Oh, that's a difficult question, isn't it? Well, I try to write about that in Global Unity of Healing. We have to understand that people are very scared. And so this hardening of boundaries, this reactive positions that are becoming more and more extreme are really a manifestation of the level of fear and confusion. Again, this 19th century dispensation pointed to a very clear path forward. Baha'u'llah said that in this age, the shift, our participation in this global shift of consciousness is through seeking to educate hearts and minds and spirits. We cannot argue, but if we listen deeply and hear where the real fears are, and are able to put forth a language that both honors these fears, but also elevates the vision and opens up more of a horizon, it can comfort and reassure hearts to become less defensive and less stuck in limited perspectives. So the path is one of education, the education of consciousness, patience, education, engaging in meaningful conversations, not reacting to reactive positions, but really deep listening, hearing the fears and starting by meeting people where they are, where the fear is arising. And always language is extremely important. I do want to say 2 words about that. In the Global Unity of Healing, the whole second part, there's 3 parts to the book. The second part is dedicated to the role of language, because language really shapes the way we think. It shapes how we make sense of things. And we're immersed in language and we don't realize how much language influences how we experience things. And so to the language of global conspiracy and paranoia that is spreading, we can respond with a language that is attuned, compassionate, but also elevates the vision and is more beautiful. So the power of language can't be underestimated, or actually can't be overestimated.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex. Thank you for your relevant and stimulating presentation. Could you relate the steps necessary to grow our consciousness to those in the 7 Valleys, 4 Valleys, or other scriptures, including non-Baha'i?
Could I relate them to the 7 and the 4 valleys? That's a very good question. I actually do that in the book. It's going to be rather difficult to do that in a 3-minute answer here. But in chapter 2 of Global Unity Healing, I describe the dual helix of the development of consciousness, the formation of ego and the cycle of formation of ego and the cycle of ego transcendence, and then related to the 4 valleys. And in chapter 4, where I speak about the role of heart in the development of mind, I also offer a brief analysis of how that correlates with the 7 valleys. So for sure, Baha'u'llah's 4 valleys and 7 valleys are profoundly mystical developmental approaches to human consciousness. And developmental psychology now is really only just beginning to speak meaningfully to the far reaches of these 4 and 7 valleys. But I do discuss that in the book a little bit more in depth.
Thank you. Scott asks, beyond health realization and the obvious value of prayer and meditation, are there other particular spiritual practices, perhaps promulgated by other psychological, spiritual, unity consciousness teachers, that you feel resonate with the Baha'i teachings and that you feel might be valuable for people to explore further? Say Eckhart Tolle's grounding in the now, Yoganada's meditation practices, chanting, etc.
So these are very good names mentioned. And another one that I find very helpful and very congruent with what Baha'is are trying to do worldwide is the last slide before the Baha'i spiritual framework for action. And that was the slide on pro-social world. This is a very recent development, but this group of people are definitely aiming global. And what they've done is they took the word of a Nobel Prize economist, Elinor Ostrom, who observed communities all over the world that thrive. And she asked the question, what makes these communities thrive? And she actually recognized core principles of the organization of sustainable small groups. And so this team, the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson and his team, which includes also psychologists, developed an approach to help groups become more cooperative and in fact acknowledge their tensions, learn how to resolve these tensions in a truly collaborative and in-depth fashion, and strengthen their will to work together. And because Baha'is work in small groups all over the world, I believe that this pro-social approach can actually be quite helpful in us also learning how to optimize our group work with people of the wide diversity that our groups comprise. I know we have the guidance of using consultative approaches, but consultation is quite an art and very complex, and we're just only trying to learn really what that looks like. There's a long way to go in terms of becoming fully consultative, and actually these core organizing principles of successful small groups very much speak to how to optimize the consultative approach. So this is just one other example. The examples are so many out there that it's truly overwhelming to try to capture everything that's so rapidly coming out now in terms of knowledge. Some of it is the physical sciences, as I said, the biological and evolutionary sciences, lots in interspirituality, education, also in psychology, as I mentioned. So I think I'll stop here. It's just a lot. It's a sea out there.
Thank you. We have another question. How do you feel we should, as a society, reconcile with conflicting historical narratives whilst humanity continues on this path? Western narratives, for example, have, I feel, a significant impact.
That's a very profound question. And again, there are no quick, excuse me, there are no quick solutions to this reality, which is quite clear. The dominance of Western narratives, excuse me. Please give me a moment. One way that we try to do that is by opening spaces which are collaborative and truly consultative. And Baha'u'llah's teachings clearly do not belong more to the West than to the East, or vice versa. But the kind of spaces that we learn to hold open, and the ways in which we carry out our consultative processes and our unitive processes really have a long way to go to learn equally from the richness, from the wealth of Asian, Middle Eastern, Far Eastern, African ways, in addition to Western, North European ways. So we really have a long way to go in the practical application of these teachings, which are very clearly universal and do not preference the West over the East. But that's part of our consciousness evolution as we form diverse groups, and we learn to work really collaboratively and consultatively and creatively in these groups. We learn to listen to each other. We learn to listen to the way hearts and minds express themselves from different cultural backgrounds. And we learn to appreciate and be enriched by that and to open ourselves to that. And it's a process of, again, consciousness evolution. So how do we do that as society? Opening meaningful spaces for such dialogue more and more and more, because these spaces do not exist in the public realm. The public realm is still very contentious, very much pertaining to the realm of conflict. So it is up to us to open these spaces wherever, on social media, in virtual meetings like this, in parks, in communities, everywhere. There's a momentum, though. There is a momentum.
Thank you. Shahla asks, is the inability to recognize and connect to Baha'u'llah's message in the belief in the idea that science and religion cannot coexist?
Could you please repeat this question? I'm not sure I understood it.
Sure. Is the inability to recognize and connect to Baha'u'llah's message relating to the belief in the idea that science and religion cannot coexist?
It seems that the answer would be yes, because the complementarity of the scientific and the contemplative perspective was first directly articulated by Baha'u'llah. But since then, it's important to recognize that more and more representatives of every wisdom tradition have pointed to that complementarity. In fact, that's the nature of the whole interspirituality global network. We know that it is under the encouragement of the Dalai Lama that the whole study of neuroscience, the neuroscience underlying mindfulness occurred under his encouragement. And so mindfulness has now become mainstream modality for treatment of anxiety and depression, but it came out of the Buddhist tradition and Buddhist understanding. So even though Baha'u'llah was really the first one to articulate directly in modern language this complementarity and to call us to begin to realize this complementarity, people are coming to it without knowing that that occurred in the mid-19th century. from various pathways. Sometimes it's from other wisdom traditions, and sometimes it's evolutionary biologists, as I just mentioned. David Sloan Wilson is a good example of that. So it's happening, and at the end of the day, such is the nature of a new cycle. It releases energy that fuels developments for centuries afterwards, and not everybody will have to equally understand where things originate, but people feel that released energy and that momentum.
Thank you. Our next question asks, in quantum physics, they often say that the opposite of a profound truth is an equally profound truth. In Baha'i scriptures, are there mentions of paradoxical truths?
Oh, Baha'i scriptures are full of paradoxical statements. I cannot possibly quote one right now. I mean, the writings are full of paradox. And in fact, that is definitely one of the multiple educational approaches that Baha'u'llah uses to evolve our consciousness. He constantly faces us with paradox, which we have to reconcile. We have to meditate and try to find a way to integrate the paradox. And that is an educational method to evolve consciousness, for sure.
Thank you. David asks, can you speak more to how mindful practice can contribute to management of stress of living in this turbulent age? And what is it?
So mindful practice is not one thing. It's a whole cluster of understandings in the plural. And so it really depends by what we understand by mindfulness practice. But from a Baha'i perspective, and I will say that the Baha'i perspective is an integral mindfulness perspective, to the extent that we're able to be awake and aware in each moment of what it is we're actually living, it does not devastate us. There could be a lot of examples on that, but when we're lost in our personal perspectives, circumstances can be quite hard to bear and to make sense of. At any moment that we're able to step back and find a place of a little bit of detachment, which is something the writings encourage greatly, we are able to see, as in that chart I showed, individual mind aligns more with universal mind. We are able to see how what we're living is part of something larger, and how our fears are really because we look at things too close up, and from a more optimal distance, perhaps everything is fundamentally okay, even when it does not feel okay. So mindfulness of history, mindfulness of society, mindfulness of my personal narratives that can really skew my own reality, mindfulness of the moment and what thoughts and experiences I'm focused on now. These are all different levels of mindfulness, from the macro to the micro, and they all influence whether we're feeling more resilient and empowered in any particular moment, or scared.
Thank you. We have a question from Shalene, and she asks, is mindfulness more like reflection and meditation? Is it more holistic approach to self-reflection?
That's a nice description, holistic approach to self-reflection. I would say yes, that's one way to think about it. As I said just now, there's many degrees and levels of mindfulness, so it's hard to summarize it with any one definition. But for sure, when we reflect, for example, when we pray and meditate and reflect on a passage, or even just an expression from the sacred writings, if we are mindful, fully present in that moment, we have experiences of opening of inner vision, of insight. We may realize things. Those things may change our perspective on the day or on what we're really facing in that moment. So that ends up becoming a very holistic experience. And I will just give you one example. Try to listen to it with a quiet mind. That the hyacinths of knowledge and wisdom may spring up fresh and green from the holy city of the heart. I'll read it one more time. That the hyacinths of knowledge and wisdom may spring up fresh and green from the holy city of the heart. Depending on the state of our own mind, when we read or hear these words, we can have a range of different experiences, visions, understanding, which may open up a much more deeply mindful perspective on our dilemmas. So that's just one example of a way to think about mindfulness.
Shahla wanted a reference to that quote.
That's Baha'u'llah. I will send the reference. I believe it was one of his hidden words. It's referenced in my book. I believe it's one of his hidden words, pretty sure.
Okay.
I can't remember which one right now.
We have a question from Scott. Can you share a bit more about the notion of interspirituality versus interfaith and where this concept/movement is gaining particular momentum, attention, notoriety?
I'll try to the extent that I understand it. So the interfaith movement, as I understand it, is a movement where the representatives of different religious traditions talk to each other, share their traditions with each other, and discuss from the point of view of every tradition how to address contemporary collective problems that we face and decisions that need to be made. They issue statements, etc. The interspirituality movement is different. It really focuses on what's universal across traditions and is not particularly focused on the maintenance of a particular tradition. It really looks at the universal core of consciousness as it is now evolving, and it seeks to foster and speak to that process, to that evolutionary process. So there is, for example, a Cosmos journal online that publishes a lot of articles from the interspirituality movement. There is a website, evolutionaryleaders.com, and these are all people who are moved by an interspiritual perspective and are applying it to evolutionary work in society. There is another website which I believe, and I can check that, I believe it was called Multiplex. I can check and let you know. And perhaps I could put that, oh yes. I can put that in at the end of the PowerPoint as a reference, perhaps, so people can check them out. Oh, there is another one, the Coming Into Spiritual Age.com. So the Coming Into Spiritual Age, all one word, .com. Then there's the multiplex.isdna.org. And that's a interspiritual multiplex resource. So to some, that may look like an extension of the New Age, but it's really gone well beyond that. because there are now very serious evolutionary initiatives that are stemming out of this interspiritual movement. And they are really like a holding environment. They're serving as a holding environment for people who are searching and do not necessarily want to preference a particular tradition, but want to understand the common core of what we're living and experiencing. So it's really a wonderful thing that's out there. And again, I'll be happy to share some of those websites.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and observations. Would you care to share how you came to study psychology and ultimately to engage with these present issues?
Well, just in a nutshell, I wanted to understand. I grew up in a communist totalitarian society, and what I really wanted to understand is why we so easily betray ourselves. And so I enrolled in a doctoral program, started to study consciousness, and halfway into my doctoral program, I was in developmental psychology. I got introduced to some Bahá'í gatherings, and I heard a macro developmental perspective, which was well beyond what graduate school was teaching me, but was very consistent with the principles of developmental psychology that I was learning. And so that really propelled my work towards the evolution of consciousness, both psychologically and spiritually. But I do believe that in each life there is a path and there is a calling, and obviously that was my path.
Thank you. Our next question asks, can there be unitive healing without forgiveness? And how would you see this reality with so many injustices, hurts, and betrayals in relationships and the world?
That's a hard one. Forgiveness does not mean endorsing certain choices and behaviors. Forgiveness does not mean not maintaining boundaries and limits. Forgiveness, as I understand it, means to be able to see the person and where they were or are in their developmental evolution, that this particular course of behavior made sense to them. And to understand how that is also a product, not just of their free will, but of the social narrative that they're living. So forgiveness to me is more about understanding how we can plumb the depths of our own indignity, as we can also plumb our furthest horizons. It really is about understanding this human predicament moment by moment, and how we can really lose sight so quickly. But that doesn't mean endorsing. And so unitive healing does require understanding of our predicament, understanding of how each person is journeying. And so in that sense, I don't think unitive healing is possible without understanding and forgiveness. But unitive healing also means proper processes, collective processes that establish parameters and borders, that establish consultative bodies that are able to maintain and restore justice. In fact, that's one of the core principles that the pro-social movement recognizes, and Elinor Ostrom recognized that if a community of any size is to be effective, there have to be proper justice maintaining processes, because otherwise there's always predators in every group. And so yes, unitive healing is about understanding and forgiving, but it's also about establishing unitive processes that protect, and I will use the language of sociobiology here, protect prosocial behavior and put limits on the opposite.
Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for questions today. But I think that all these questions really deepened all of our understandings, and it was just really great to hear everyone's perspective on the topic.
Thank you very much. It was really my pleasure.
Thank you again. So our speaker next week is going to be Dr. Houshmand Badi'i, and his topic is, Can our economic system ever become ethical and spiritual? A Baha'i perspective. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Standard Time, so please invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please fill out the Google form that we'll put in the chat below. And now we're just going to close with a quote by Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, followed by a quote from Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, set to music.
The one true God beareth me witness, and his creatures will testify, that not for a moment did I allow myself to be hidden from the eyes of men, nor did I consent to shield my person from their injury. Before the face of all men I have arisen, and bidden them fulfill my pleasure. My object is none other than the betterment of the world and the tranquility of its peoples. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. This unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels which the pen of the Most High hath revealed are suffered to pass unheeded. Baha'u'llah.
Have a great week, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Bye.